The storm roared over the airbase, tearing at hangars, howling through radio towers. Alarms screamed, red lights flashed. 12 enemy jets streaked toward the defenseless base. Inside, officers shouted orders that no one could answer. There were no pilots, no time. And then through the blinding rain, one figure stepped onto the tarmac. Captain Evelyn Ward, silent, determined. She paused beside the last fighter jet, rain streaming down her face, eyes fixed on the storm. If no one else will, I will. Without waiting for permission, she climbed into the cockpit. Engines roared to life. The ground shook as she accelerated down the runway, vanishing into the storm. 1 against 12. A base's last hope. From the time she could walk, Evelyn Ward was drawn to the sky. Born and raised just outside Eglin Air Force Base in the Florida Panhandle, her childhood was marked by the sound of engines roaring overhead and the shimmer of sunlight glinting off jet wings. Her father worked as a mechanic on base. Her mother taught at the local elementary school. But it was the sight of F-15s and F-16s streaking across the horizon that filled Evelyn's imagination. Neighbors recalled how she would sit in the truck bed with her father after supper, feet dangling, pointing out contrails against the pink Florida sunsets. On Saturdays, she'd ride her bike to the fence line and watch pilots run through their drills, eyes wide, heart racing with each takeoff. By age 10, she could identify aircraft by silhouette alone. Evelyn wasn't just a dreamer, she was determined. In high school, she earned top marks in science and math and spent hours at the library reading books on aerodynamics and aviation history. Teachers remembered her quiet intensity, the way she focused on her goals without seeking the spotlight. When she applied to the Air Force Academy, no one was surprised she was accepted, only that she'd done so with little fanfare. Her rise through the ranks was swift and well-earned. During Operation Desert Storm, Evelyn distinguished herself not just through skill, but through extraordinary instinct. Her call sign, Whisper, reflected her ability to move unseen and strike when least expected. Enemy radar operators reported sudden, inexplicable losses. Pilots who thought themselves safe only to find an F-16 on their tail. Her fellow aviators spoke of her uncanny calm, even under the fiercest fire. But war is rarely fair, and fate had its say. During a routine patrol near hostile territory, Evelyn's F-16 suffered catastrophic mechanical failure. The engine sputtered, then died altogether, leaving her no choice but to attempt an emergency landing deep in the enemy-controlled desert. She survived the crash with cracked ribs, a concussion, and burns along her left arm. Somehow, despite her injuries, she evaded enemy patrols, navigating 12 miles on foot under brutal sun and through hostile terrain, until she reached friendly lines. That should have been the stuff of commendations and medals. But questions arose, first in whispers, then in classified briefings. How had her engine failed? Could the landing have been avoided? How had she evaded capture for so long? There were no charges, no official inquiry. But in the corridors of command, doubt took root. Some suspected political friction behind the scenes. Perhaps Evelyn's growing reputation had stirred jealousy. Perhaps the higher-ups, eager to avoid scrutiny of equipment failures, found it easier to let the questions swirl around the pilot rather than the jet. Whatever the cause, the result was the same. Evelyn was offered reassignment, not to the sky, but to a desk. She could have fought it. Some said she should have. But Evelyn, ever the quiet warrior, chose not to drag others through the mud. If they don't want me in the air, she told a trusted mentor, then I'll serve another way. And so the pilot called Whisper faded from the skies. The girl who'd grown up beneath contrails became a name on a roster, a presence in the background. But deep inside, the fire never dimmed. And though others might have forgotten who she was, Evelyn Ward never did. Building 47 wasn't much to look at. A plain, squat structure on the edge of the airfield at Eglin, with no windows on its north side and a constant hum of fluorescent lights inside. It was the kind of place most airmen passed without a second thought, the kind of place where paperwork lived, where operations were planned and tracked, but where glory was absent. It was here that Captain Evelyn Ward made herself invisible. For 8 long years, she arrived before dawn, slipping through the side entrance with a cup of burnt coffee and a stack of reports tucked beneath her arm. Her days were consumed by rosters and readiness schedules, flight maintenance logs, fuel allocations, and equipment requisitions. Evelyn handled every task with meticulous precision. If a pilot needed to know when a part would arrive, or a mechanic wanted to trace an error in the system, they came to her. If the wing commander demanded readiness stats at a moment's notice, Evelyn had them at her fingertips, but few noticed. To most, she was simply Ward, the quiet admin officer who worked late and never complained, who never sought attention or credit. The younger pilots, those who came after Desert Storm, knew her only as the woman behind the desk, the one who kept the paperwork moving so they could fly. To them, she was part of the furniture, no different from the file cabinets that lined the walls or the computers humming in the corner. And Evelyn encouraged that perception. She kept her uniform crisp but unadorned. She rarely spoke of her past, never volunteered stories about combat or camaraderie in the cockpit. When talk around the break room turned to missions or war stories, she listened politely, offering a small smile but little more. The few colleagues who knew the truth, the senior officers who remembered the pilot called Whisper, respected her choice to fade quietly into the background. But the sky never truly let her go. Night after night, long after the building emptied and the airfield fell silent, save for the occasional security patrol, Evelyn stayed behind. She'd lock herself in the simulator room, a place meant for training new recruits, and run through scenarios. Enemy intercepts, evasive maneuvers, dogfights in impossible conditions. The flight controls beneath her hands felt familiar, natural. The hum of the simulated engines was the only music that ever settled her mind. She kept her skills sharp in other ways too. Evelyn subscribed to every tactical journal she could find, poring over updates on aircraft systems, enemy capabilities, electronic warfare advances. She studied flight manuals until the pages wore thin, reviewed after-action reports from other pilots, as if she'd been there herself. Her quarters reflected this quiet dedication. While others decorated with photos, keepsakes, and medals, Evelyn's walls were bare, save for a single-frame print of the Florida sky streaked with contrails at sunset. Beneath her bed, neatly stacked, were binders of notes and schematics, flight patterns she'd memorized, checklists she still ran through every morning out of habit. It wasn't that Evelyn hoped for another chance to fly. She didn't allow herself that luxury. But deep down she knew the day might come when someone, somewhere, would need more than a name on a roster. And if that day came, she would be ready. So she worked in silence, served without complaint, and waited. The world saw a woman behind a desk, a quiet administrator lost in paperwork. But inside, where it counted, Evelyn Ward was still Whisper, and the sky was never far from her heart. It began like any other morning, a winter dawn breaking over Eglin Air Force Base, with gray clouds hanging low and the air heavy with moisture. The base was quiet, too quiet. Most of the pilots were off rotation, the night crew wrapping up their shifts, the day team slowly filtering in. A skeleton crew held down the operations center, their voices low, their movements easy. Inside Building 47, Captain Evelyn Ward sat at her desk, nursing a cup of coffee that tasted like ash. She scanned the overnight reports, mentally adjusting supply schedules, making notes on fuel reserves, preparing to brief the wing commander. It was the kind of work that kept the base running, even if no one ever thanked her for it. Then the alarms shattered the morning calm. First came the rising whine of the alert sirens, long, mournful wails that froze hearts and stopped conversations mid-sentence. Then the radios erupted with overlapping voices, and then the lights, red strobes flashing through every corridor, across every hangar, casting a surreal glow on the rain-slicked tarmac. Evelyn didn't have to ask. She knew. She was already moving as officers rushed past, as junior staff scrambled for headsets, as the command center filled with panicked voices. At the radar console, a young lieutenant barked out the grim report. 12 unidentified aircraft inbound. Hostile pattern confirmed. Moving fast. ETA, 8 minutes. The room spun into action, but action without purpose. Calls were made. Orders barked. Fingers jabbed at screens, but no one had answers. Where were the pilots? Who could scramble fast enough in this weather? What defenses did they have left when most of the base's best were hundreds of miles away? Evelyn stood still in the storm of voices. She listened. She watched. She calculated. 2 fighters were ready. That was all. 2 pilots were available. Both green, neither having seen combat beyond training exercises. 2 against 12. That wasn't a fight. That was a slaughter. Her mind raced through the possibilities, the probabilities, and the hard truth. The base was vulnerable. The men and women here, the mechanics, the clerks, the technicians, were as good as unarmed. The enemy wasn't coming for a warning shot. This was an assault. Planned, coordinated, deadly, and no one was left to stop it. That's when Evelyn moved. Without speaking, without seeking permission, she turned on her heel and walked out of the operations center. She crossed the empty hall, passed through the side door, and stepped into the storm. Rain slashed down in sheets driven by winds that howled across the airfield. The tarmac glistened with standing water, the hangars looming dark and still. But she kept walking, her boots splashing through puddles, her uniform soaked through in seconds. Hangar C rose before her, a shadow in the storm. Inside, under emergency protocols, sat one last hope, a prototype fighter, fueled and ready, unassigned because no one had dared risk it yet. Evelyn entered like she belonged there. In truth, she did. A technician spotted her and stepped forward. "Ma'am, you can't be here. This is restricted. We're under alert." Her voice cut through the storm. Calm, clear. "Emergency protocols authorize all qualified combat personnel. That's me." The tech hesitated, caught between regulation and the sheer force of her presence. By the time he found his words, she was already pulling on the flight gear, strapping in, sealing her helmet, powering up the systems she knew as well as her own heartbeat. The engines roared to life, a sound that drowned the wind and the rain and the doubt. Radio voices crackled as the tower tried to assert control. "Unidentified pilot in Ghost Hawk 1, state your name. This is unauthorized. Return to hangar immediately." Evelyn keyed the mic. For the first time in 8 years, she said it aloud. "This is Whisper. Ghost Hawk 1. Lifting off." The tower fell silent for one stunned heartbeat. Then came the shouting, the orders, the panic. But by then, she was already moving. The jet surged down the runway, afterburners blazing. The ground shook beneath her as the wheels left the earth. She climbed into the storm, into the gray, into the unknown. 12 against 1. The base's last hope had taken to the sky. And far below, those who'd thought of Evelyn Ward as just a clerk, just an administrator, just another name on a roster. They watched in awe as the woman who'd been forgotten became their shield. The day the sky fell, Evelyn Ward rose to meet it. The storm swallowed her as the wheels retracted and the jet climbed into the dark. Inside the cockpit, the world became a symphony of data and instinct. The steady hum of the engines, the flicker of instruments, the hiss of the radio as panicked voices tried to call her back. Evelyn tuned it out. The storm outside was nothing compared to the storm within. 12 enemy aircraft, well-trained, well-armed, coordinated. She could see their formation on radar. Tight, professional, a spear aimed straight at the base she'd left below. Evelyn's eyes narrowed. She'd seen this kind of assault before. They weren't here to test the defenses. They were here to destroy. But she was here to stop them. She pushed the throttle forward, feeling the jet respond like an old friend. The prototype fighter moved with the grace of a bird of prey, its cutting-edge systems humming beneath her hands. Despite the 8 years she'd spent on the ground, muscle memory guided her. This was where she belonged. The enemy formation came into visual range, dark shapes slicing through the clouds, their red marker lights blinking like eyes in the storm. Evelyn positioned herself high, the storm clouds behind her, the sun a faint glow at her back. It was the classic ambush angle. She lined up her first shot. Her targeting system locked. The tone sounded steady, sure. Fox 2. The missile streaked away, vanishing into the storm. A heartbeat later, it found its mark. The lead jet erupted in a fireball that tore through the formation. 11 left. The enemy scattered, their tight pattern unraveling into chaos. That was the key. Break their coordination, and the odds improved. But they recovered fast, regrouping into smaller elements, hunting for the attacker they hadn't expected. Evelyn was already moving, banking hard to the left, using the clouds and rain as cover. She dropped altitude fast, skimming the lower storm layer, then climbed again to line up another shot. The second missile hit clean. Another jet down, 10. The storm hit her as much as it hindered her. The enemy pilots were good, no question. They fanned out, trying to bracket her, force her into a kill zone. Evelyn anticipated the move, rolling inverted, diving toward the deck, the rain hammering the canopy as she skimmed the tree line. A jet peeled off to chase her. She let him close, drawing him in, then pulled up hard into a tight loop that brought her behind him in seconds. Guns only. The 20mm cannon barked. The enemy jet spiraled down, flames trailing into the forest below. 9. Radio chatter filled her ears. Tower trying to recall her, command demanding identification, confused pilots asking who was in the sky. But she had no time for explanations, only action. The enemy jets shifted tactics, half of them heading for the base, the other half trying to pin her down. Evelyn had to choose, engage the group attacking the base or defend herself. There was no choice. She climbed fast and steep, putting herself between the attackers and the base. Her next missile found its mark. 8. The storm became a dance floor of death. Evelyn wove through it, every maneuver textbook, every shot deliberate. She knew the limits of the jet, the flow of the fight. Training took over, reflexes honed over years, instincts born from a lifetime beneath the roar of engines. Another missile, 7. Cannon burst at close range, 6. Outmaneuvered another to force a collision, 5. But the odds were catching up. Fuel low, ammunition nearly gone. Warning lights blinked across her console. The enemy pilots realized she wasn't an easy target. They regrouped, trying to overwhelm her with numbers. Evelyn smiled beneath her visor. They thought numbers would save them, but numbers meant nothing to a pilot who could outthink them all. She dove again, rolling through the clouds, letting one enemy overshoot, then climbing beneath him and firing her last missile. 4. The remaining jets hesitated. That was the moment she'd been fighting for. They broke off, not out of fear, out of respect. They knew they'd been bested, and Evelyn let them go. The point was made. The base was safe. The storm for now had passed. She turned toward home, the radio filled with voices, at last realizing who had saved them. Ghost Hawk 1, this is Tower. Whisper, is that really you? This is Whisper, returning to base. The impossible fight was over, 1 against 12, and she'd stood alone, victorious. The storm still lashed the airfield as Captain Evelyn Ward guided the battered fighter toward the runway. The afterburners glowed faint in the rain-soaked dawn, the jet cutting through the sheets of water with the precision of a returning predator. The ground crews, the officers, the airmen, all who had stood helpless just minutes earlier, now gathered along the tarmac, their faces tilted upward, eyes wide with disbelief. The jet's tires kissed the runway with a hiss of steam and spray. Evelyn brought the aircraft to a stop, the engine's hum fading into the storm's roar. Inside the cockpit, the silence was deafening after the chaos of combat. Her hands, steady throughout the impossible fight, now trembled slightly on the controls. Not from fear, not from fatigue, but from the sudden, overwhelming weight of what had just passed. She popped the canopy. The rain hit her face like a baptism, cool, cleansing. She drew a slow breath of the storm-heavy air and unfastened her harness. Then, with practiced ease, she climbed down, boots hitting the wet tarmac as the gathered crowd parted, unsure what to say, what to do. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then came the slow clap. From the edge of the crowd stepped Brigadier General Thomas Crane, base commander, a man who'd flown combat missions in Vietnam and worn the scars to prove it. He didn't smile. Crane rarely did, but his eyes shone with respect. Clap, clap, clap. The sound echoed against the hangars, joined by others, spreading through the gathering until the entire line of personnel, from mechanics to command staff, stood applauding the woman they'd overlooked for 8 years. Evelyn didn't acknowledge the applause, not out of pride, but because the mission wasn't about recognition. She simply met the general's gaze, nodded once, and stood silent as the rain continued to fall. Colonel Harris, the operations officer, pushed through the crowd, face tight with conflicting emotions. Captain Ward, you were in violation of direct orders. You had no authorization to take that jet. You... General Crane raised a hand. She saved this base, Colonel. 12 enemy fighters down. No damage. No casualties. That sounds like authorization enough to me. Harris bristled. Sir, we'll need to file a full report. Regulations require, and you'll file it, but I'll be signing it. The general's voice left no room for argument. The investigation that followed was brief. What could they say? The data told a story better than any report. 1 pilot, 12 enemy aircraft engaged, 11 destroyed, the base intact, mission accomplished. The fact that Evelyn's fuel had run to fumes, that her ammunition was nearly gone, that she'd flown a prototype with no support. None of that changed the outcome. Her combat certification was restored quietly, as if it had never been taken. She was offered transfer back to active combat squadrons with options to lead, to train, to fly again in official capacity. But Evelyn declined. I'm where I need to be, she said, her voice calm, certain. I didn't do it for a promotion. I did it because someone had to. Instead, she returned to Building 47. But things were different now. The pilots who had once passed her without notice now stopped to seek her advice. The young airmen who'd never heard of Whisper before that day now listened closely when she spoke. Evelyn became something new, not just a quiet administrator, not just a hidden warrior, but a mentor. She ran informal sessions on tactics, taught survival strategies, shared lessons that no manual could offer. She spoke little of her flight that day, but she didn't have to. The legend spoke for itself. A small photo was mounted in the new training wing. Evelyn standing beside the jet in the storm, rain streaming down her face. The caption was simple: pilot, guardian, whisper. And on nights when the weather turned foul, when the rain lashed the runway and the storm winds howled across the field, some in the control tower swore they could hear a familiar voice crackle through the radio. Ghost Hawk 1, whisper, watching the skies. And no one ever doubted that she was. There's something about Evelyn Ward's story that stays with you long after the last engine roar fades. Maybe it's because she reminds us of a truth we often forget, that heroes don't always stand in the spotlight. Sometimes they choose the shadows, not because they lack courage, but because their sense of duty runs deeper than pride. I think about Evelyn, day after day, showing up at Building 47, filing reports, tracking maintenance schedules, keeping the machine of the base turning while others soared above. It's easy to dismiss people like that, to overlook the quiet workers, the ones who make sure everyone else has what they need to succeed. But Evelyn wasn't hiding out of weakness. She made a conscious choice. After the crash, after the whispers, she could have fought the system, demanded hearings, stirred headlines. She didn't. Not because she agreed with what was done to her, but because she chose service over self. That kind of humility is rare, and it's powerful. When I reflect on the moment she stepped onto that tarmac, alone in the storm, I see more than just a pilot reclaiming her place. I see every man and woman who's ever set aside recognition, who's ever quietly done what was right, knowing there might be no thanks, no medals. I see the veteran who volunteers at the local school, the retired mechanic who fixes a neighbor's car for free, the nurse who stays an extra shift because she can't walk away when someone's in need. Evelyn didn't step into that jet hoping to prove anything. She did it because the base needed saving, and she had the skill, the will, and the heart to act. And that's what duty truly means. It's not about what's written on a piece of paper or what rank you wear. It's about answering the call when it comes, even if that call is a whisper in your own soul. I've met veterans who remind me of Evelyn, folks who once led missions, commanded teams, flew into danger, now living quietly among us. And too often we pass them by without a second glance. We see a clerk or a janitor or a retiree on a park bench, and we don't stop to wonder what stories they carry, what sacrifices they've made. Evelyn's story is a reminder that valor doesn't fade just because it's out of sight, that behind every quiet face might be a warrior waiting for the moment when they're needed most. And I think that's what makes her choice in the aftermath so meaningful. She could have grabbed the headlines, taken the glory, demanded a return to the skies. Instead, she stayed where she felt she could do the most good, guiding, mentoring, preparing others. She turned her experience into a gift for the next generation. If there's a lesson in Evelyn Ward's impossible fight, it's this. Heroes aren't defined by their rank or their title. They're defined by their choices. And sometimes the bravest choice is to serve quietly until the day comes when quiet service must give way to action. And when that day comes, may we all have the courage to rise as Evelyn did. After that day, nothing on the base looked quite the same. Not the hangars, not the runways, and certainly not the woman walking the corridors of Building 47. Evelyn Ward returned to her desk, to the stacks of reports, the rosters, the quiet rhythm of logistics. But everyone knew now. The woman who'd once blended into the background had reminded them all what quiet strength truly meant. Young pilots, the same ones who once hurried past her door, began to pause, seeking her advice on tactics or just listening when she spoke. They came not because of her rank, but because of the weight behind her words. Evelyn didn't boast, didn't dramatize. When she shared, it was practical. Lessons on reading the sky, managing fear, knowing when to fight and when to endure. And they listened because they knew she had lived it. Evelyn never wanted ceremonies, but the base quietly found ways to honor her. In the new training wing, a small photograph was mounted. It wasn't posed or polished. It captured that moment on the storm-lashed tarmac. Evelyn beside the jet, rain streaming down her face, eyes focused on the horizon. Beneath it, just 3 words: pilot, guardian, whisper. It wasn't hung at the entrance or under a spotlight. It was placed where cadets would see it as they headed into their classrooms. A reminder of the kind of leader they might aspire to be. Her story became part of the base's culture. New recruits heard about the day the sky fell and the quiet woman who rose to meet it. They studied her maneuvers in simulators. They debated how she outthought and outflew 12 enemy pilots. But more than that, they reflected on what it meant to be ready, not for medals, but for the moment when you're needed most. Evelyn's impact wasn't limited to tactics. She shaped how people thought about service. She taught that heroism isn't always loud, that you don't need to chase recognition to make a difference. That duty can mean filing reports with care, training others with patience, and standing up at the right moment without waiting to be asked. Over time, Evelyn's legend stretched beyond the base. Pilots at other installations spoke of her with respect. Veterans groups shared her story as an example of quiet valor, and in small ways her name became a code for readiness, for humility, for the kind of strength that waits until it's called upon. Late at night, when storms rolled over the base and the control tower stood lonely against the rain, some operators swore they'd hear a voice crackle through the radio. Calm, steady. Ghost Hawk 1. Whisper. Watching the skies. No one investigated. No one questioned. Some traditions are better left as they are. Reminders of those who've served not for glory, but for the good of others. Evelyn continued to serve, not as a headline, but as a mentor, a protector, a guardian. And when she finally retired years later, she left behind no statues, no grand memorials, just generations of pilots who flew better, led wiser, and stood taller because of her. That's legacy, not what's carved in stone, but what lives on in others. Evelyn Ward's legacy wasn't the number of enemy fighters she downed that day. It was the courage she inspired, the lives she touched, and the reminder that true warriors don't need to be seen, only ready. Evelyn Ward's story isn't just about one pilot or one impossible mission. It's about the quiet strength that lives in so many of us, and how that strength can change the world when the moment calls for it. In today's fast-paced society, where loud voices often take center stage, we sometimes forget the value of steady hands, thoughtful action, and humble service. How many Evelyns do we pass by every day? The neighbor who watches out for the whole street, the veteran who quietly volunteers at the local food pantry, the grandparent who teaches lessons not with lectures, but through example. Evelyn's legacy reminds us that courage and duty aren't about titles. They're about choices. And in this modern world, maybe that's a lesson worth revisiting. With so much focus on fame and recognition, What would it look like if more of us chose to serve quietly, prepared to step up when needed? Not for praise, but because it's right? I'd love to hear your thoughts. Have you known someone like Evelyn in your own life? Or maybe you have faced a moment when duty called, even if no one noticed. Share your story in the comments. Your experiences matter, and they help keep these values alive for the next generation. Thank you for taking the time to listen today. If Evelyn's story inspired you, please give this video a like, and don't forget to subscribe for more true stories of hidden heroes. Together, let's honor those who serve, in big ways and in quiet ones. Thank you for watching. We'll see you in the next story.